I would like to preface this video by saying that this guide will focus on the mechanics of Amber's meld team and how I've been making C2 Amber work in my team, rather than discuss character kits and how to build the team, though I'll still mention a few details in these areas throughout the video. Additionally, I know there are other variants of Amber's meld team, but I'll focus on the specific 4-star character's meld team shown on the screen, as I wanted to apply Furu's meld team to C2 Amber. If you want more details on those other topics, I'll link guides from other players such as Furu and Nitro Tom. They've made excellent guides on different types of Amber teams and how to build them. This video will be divided into the following sections shown on the screen. Feel free to skip to any parts of the video if you're already familiar with some of these topics. I'll start off by briefly describing the Bunny-Nuking playstyle. This playstyle involves maximizing value out of Amber's C2 constellation, which gives Baron Bunny a 200% damage bonus when Amber shoots an arrow in the area around Baron Bunny's foot. Because of the outstanding area of effect damage a manually detonated Baron Bunny can produce, players will focus all their resources from supports into Amber before detonating Baron Bunny. With Amber's C4 constellation, Baron Bunny receives a cooldown reduction from 15 seconds to 12 seconds and gains 2 charges, which gives Amber higher damage potential. This relatively large damage output makes Bunny-Nuking the most popular playstyle Amber players use in a Spiral Abyss. Despite touching on C4 Amber a few times, I'd like to reiterate that this video will describe how I've been trying to make Amber work without this powerful constellation. Unfortunately, I don't have C4 Amber at the time of releasing this video. The lack of Amber's C4 constellation creates the following issues. Firstly, I'm missing one Bunny nuke each rotation, which drops Amber's DPS output considerably. This also results in a considerable amount of DPS downtime, so I make up for this by using charge attacks. Secondly, Amber has energy issues without the second Baron Bunny each rotation. For context, Baron Bunny produces 4 pyro particles, which gives Amber 12 energy, and Amber's burst cost is 40 energy. However, it may be unclear why this second issue is a problem. To give some context, some players will slot in a Nemo character and use the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer artifact set for debuffing the enemy's pyro res. If Amber is the only pyro character on the team, there are only 3 ways to apply a pyro aura on the enemy: using a charge attack, blowing up Baron Bunny, or using Amber's burst. The problem with the first 2 options is that they are relatively slow and awkward for the rotation. That is, you need to manually apply pyro with a charge attack or spend time either waiting for Baron Bunny to explode or manually blow it up. Additionally, we want to maximize Baron Bunny's damage, so using its cooldown early for this purpose will make Amber lose out on a lot of damage potential. Moreover, if there's already a cryo aura on the enemy, the player would have to override it with a pyro aura using multiple charged attacks or Baron Bunnies, which becomes increasingly difficult when there's a source of cryo application on field. With Amber's ult, however, the player has access to a fast source of pyro application that makes it difficult for other sources of cryo application to override this pyro aura. This gives the Anemo character an opportunity to swirl pyro. Thus, because of the importance of Amber's burst in the rotation, we have to solve her energy issue. I'll be basing my guide on the 4-star character's meld team, consisting of Amber, Rosaria, Diona, and Sucrose, which is the team I used in the Spiral Abyss. Regarding their roles, Amber serves as the main DPS of the team and the enabler for Sucrose to debuff the enemy's pyro res. I chose to run 4-piece Wanderer's Troop on her because, as mentioned previously, I need to make up for the lack of a second bunny by using charge attacks. However, I should still try to maximize Baron Bunny's damage, which the 80 Elemental Mastery from the 2-piece effect helps with. For my weapon choice, I use Thundering Pulse because that's the best weapon I have for her. Rosaria fulfills a few roles. Most importantly, she's the main cryo applicator, but she's also the Noblesse Oblige user and the energy support for the team. I'll also briefly mention that with the specific way I use her in my rotation, she can also be used as a sub DPS. I also equipped Favonius Lance on her. I have 2 reasons for making her the Favonius user on my team. Firstly, R5's cooldown matches Rosaria's skill cooldown nicely. Secondly, the other supports on the team have access to strong support weapons for Amber. Diona is the team's healer and shielder, but she's also an elemental mastery buffer. I run 4-piece Instructor and Elegy for the end on her. Sucrose is another elemental mastery buffer, but she also provides the Viridescent Venerer debuff and Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's buff to Amber, as well as some crowd control for the team. I believe it's important to mention how I build crit rate for Amber and Rosaria in this team. Because Baron Bunny only deals a single instance of damage, it's important to build a high crit rate on Amber because the team's rotation will lose a big portion of its damage output if Amber's Baron Bunny doesn't score a critical hit. I tried to aim for at least a 75% crit rate on Amber and around 66% crit rate or more on Rosaria. This means Rosaria will share around 10% crit rate with Amber. On top of the 15% crit rate for Cryo Resonance, this means Amber's bunnies, and technically some of the follow-up charge attacks, will score critical hits 100% of the time. I also tested the minimum energy recharge required on these characters against weekly bosses, which don't drop any energy. I'll show on screen what I discovered. I should clarify that this assumes that Rosaria triggers Favonius Lance's passive every time she uses her skill in the full rotation, which doesn't always happen, so you may not want to build the bare minimum energy recharge shown on the screen. Additionally, this also assumes that Amber lands her Baron Bunny's damage every rotation. I usually reset Spiral Abyss runs when this happens, but for players who are okay with the Missed Bunny, I suggest building at least 120% energy recharge on Amber to make up for the lack of pyro particles from the bunny. For Sucrose, you technically don't need her burst to pull off the basic rotation, though I still rolled out 130% energy recharge because I will talk about an advanced rotation later in the video that uses her burst every other rotation to provide an alternate way to give elemental mastery buffs to Amber. Now, I would like to reiterate that I tested the minimum energy recharge required in a setting where enemies drop 0 energy, so treat these energy recharge values as a baseline. That covers all the basic information about my build for each character and their roles on the C2 Melt Amber team. Next, I'll discuss all the buffs available for Amber and the basic rotation I came up with. Because we still want to maximize Baron Bunny's damage, we need to find a way to apply all the buffs available in the team to Amber without them wearing off before Baron Bunny registers damage on the enemy. I'll list on screen the buffs we need to feed into Amber. Noblesse Oblige's attack buff, Rosaria's crit rate buff, Elegy for the End's elemental mastery and attack buff, C6 Diona's elemental mastery buff, 4-piece Instructor's elemental mastery buff, Sucrose's elemental mastery share from both of her ascension passives, the Pyro Viridescent Venerer debuff, Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's attack buff, and the attack buff from Polar Star's stacks. I assume most players don't have this weapon, but for those who do, I'll mention a stack building strategy after the rotation. On a related note, Sucrose's Ascension 4 passive can pass 20% of elemental mastery buffs from other sources like C6 Diona's signature mix to Amber, so we want to use Diona's burst and trigger 4-piece Instructor's set effect before we use Sucrose's skill in a rotation. Lastly, from my experience, the minimum number of times Rosaria must use her skill to generate enough energy for Amber to get her burst back every rotation is 3, with 1 instance of particles being funneled into Amber. Now, that's a lot of buffs we need to manage, but I do have a fixed rotation that applies these buffs to Amber such that they don't wear off before Baron Bunny registers damage on the enemy. I'll be basing the rotation time on the ability with the highest cooldown on the team, which is Diona's signature mix. Before I show the full rotation, however, I want to mention that I'll be showing the most basic form of the rotation. There are ways to slightly increase the team's damage output, but I'll save the advanced rotation for later. I'll now describe the basic full rotation and display timers on the screen to show roughly how much time each buff has before they wear off. We start off with Diona's hold skill, then Rosaria's skill, Sucrose's normal attack, Amber's burst, Diona's burst, Sucrose's skill, Rosaria's burst into skill, Amber's skill, and then detonate Baron Bunny, Amber's first charge attack, then a second charge attack, Rosaria's skill, Amber's third charge attack, and fourth charge attack. You might notice that adding Amber's fourth charge attack extends the rotation to 21 seconds instead of 20. The reason I included this fourth charge attack is that without this extra charge attack, it's possible to complete the rotation in 19 seconds, which means you may miss out on the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's buff in the next rotation and awkwardly wait for Diona's signature mix to come off cooldown. Additionally, Rosaria's first skill in the rotation won't be off cooldown unless we spend that extra time to use a fourth charge attack on Amber. Thus, it helps ensure a smoother rotation. For players with Polar Star, it's possible to obtain all 4 stacks of the weapon's passive before Amber detonates Baron Bunny. Fortunately, Amber already gains 2 stacks from casting her burst and skill in the rotation, so we just need to add a normal attack and charge attack. Based on my observations from other players, the best time to do a quick normal attack and charge attack in a rotation is right before Amber casts her burst, as shown on the screen. It may take a bit of time to get used to the timing, so a good indicator to check for if you're doing this combo as fast as possible is seeing if the arrow spawns around the bottom right corner of your screen. I'll include some footage of successful and failed attempts. That covers all the basic information about the team's mechanics. In the next chapter, I'll describe how to optimize gameplay for this team. The rest of this guide will cover the advanced mechanics of the 4-star character's Melt Amber team. I'll first cover some information about the team and the rotation itself. Then, I'll describe ways to optimize each character's actions in a rotation. Starting, I'll talk about the soft commit rotation. I'll use this phrase to refer to a rotation used to finish off an enemy without committing many resources. The only burst we'll commit is Rosaria's burst, though she should still get enough energy in a soft commit rotation to sustain the first full rotation in the next chamber of the Spiral Abyss. The soft commit rotation is as follows. Apply Pyro using Amber's charge attack, then use Sucrose's skill, Diona's hold skill, Rosaria's skill into burst, Amber's skill, detonate Baron Bunny, and use extra charge attacks if needed. If done fast enough, Rosaria should catch the particles from Diona after casting Rites of Termination. However, if you have trouble casting Rosaria's burst before Diona's particles reach her, you can try standing a small distance from your enemy before holding Diona's skill. Or, you can cast Rosaria's burst before using her skill and wait a bit to let Rosaria catch her own particles. You might not always get Rosaria's burst back after the soft commit rotation, but she should get close to getting it back. Her burst meter should be filled enough to complete the first full rotation in the next chamber of the Spiral Abyss, assuming you built enough energy recharge on her. The second point I want to mention about the team is that the rotation itself has many iframes available, especially when you add dashes before or after using abilities. This sometimes allows you to get away with committing the rotation in situations that otherwise would be dangerous. For example, let's look at my footage in the 3.8 Spiral Abyss cycle against the Bathysmal Bishop herd. Standing in the center of the double beam attack would normally kill a character. However, when I commit the whole rotation in this attack, notice how I didn't take much damage. The point is, when your characters are healthy, don't be afraid to risk committing your rotation in situations where you usually take a huge amount of damage, especially in the Spiral Abyss where every bit of extra time sometimes counts. The relatively large number of iframes in the rotation should nullify a lot of incoming damage. That's all the information I have about additional team mechanics. I'll now talk about additional mechanics for each character on a team, starting with Amber. Being the main DPS of the Melt team, Amber has quite a few additional mechanics to enhance her gameplay. I'll start with one of her most important mechanics, Bunny-Nuking. Baron Bunny's area of effect damage has a small radius. For it to register damage, it must sit close to the enemy. Often, you might place Baron Bunny just a little too far from the enemy, but you can fix your placement by using Amber's hitbox to push it. One way to make nudging easier is to aim down sights while nudging the bunny. Not only do you charge up a shot to detonate Baron Bunny in the first place, but you can also use the movement penalty when aiming down sights to push it around more carefully. One issue you may sometimes run into is accidentally placing Baron Bunny on top of the enemy, which makes it awkward to shoot the area around Baron Bunny's foot. For the game to detect an arrow near Baron Bunny's foot while it's sitting on the enemy, you have to directly hit the enemy with an arrow. Consequently, you also risk removing the Cryo Aura before Baron Bunny detonates. To avoid these issues, I turn Amber to the side before deploying Baron Bunny. You also have the option to land a charged attack on a weak spot to trigger Amber's 4th Ascension passive, which gives a 15% attack buff. If you recall the rotation with Polar Star, I mentioned that the best time to use a charge attack for building stacks is right before Amber uses her ult. I'd recommend triggering this 15% attack buff during this part of the rotation too. Alternatively, you can instead land an arrow on a weak spot directly before or after deploying Baron Bunny, though I find trying to trigger the buff in this part of the rotation awkward because of the amount of hand motion required. Once again, similar to the caveat about building stacks on Polar Star, trying to trigger this 15% attack buff does make the rotation tighter, so use this mechanic at your discretion. In my experience, there are rare cases where intentionally holding Baron Bunny and using a charge attack first in the rotation is the better play. Specifically, if you're expecting an attack from the enemy that will knock Baron Bunny away from it, then it's better to hold Baron Bunny and lose a buff than to deploy it and have it knocked far away from the enemy. This is because you'll be forced to run to Baron Bunny and spend time just nudging the bunny back in range to hit the enemy, potentially losing several buffs in the process. At that point, you would have been better off using charge attacks instead to at least deal some damage to the enemy during that downtime. To give an example of me averting this situation, Let's examine a case in my run against the triple Magu Kenkis in a 3.6 Spiral Abyss rotation. I saw the Galloping Frost Kenki charge up its plunging attack, so I waited to deploy Baron Bunny after I iframed the attack to ensure I could deploy Baron Bunny close to all 3 Kenkis. As a result, I still managed to land a relatively high damage value on all 3 of them. Now, I don't want to make it seem like having Baron Bunny knocked away from the enemy is a huge loss in value. There is a way to recover from a situation like this. While charging up an arrow to detonate Baron Bunny, if you see it knocked away from the enemy, you don't have to cancel the charged attack. Instead, redirect that arrow at the enemy while making your way to Baron Bunny. Additionally, while nudging the bunny, you can try to fire arrows at the enemy until the bunny is in range to deal damage. I do want to mention that this can be difficult to pull off because you're multitasking, and I still struggle doing this in my own runs. However, if you can pull this off, then you won't lose out on much damage. The next mechanic can apply to all bow characters in the game, but I'll still mention it because of its usefulness in certain situations. Virtually every enemy in this game is programmed to not lead the projectiles they aim at you. Specifically, this means enemies aim at your specific position rather than in the direction you're moving towards. Because Amber, who is a bow character, can move while aiming, this means she can dodge most projectile attacks simply by strafing in one direction. The most notable example is the rapid-fire projectile attack by the Baptismal Bishop Herd. Notice on screen that merely moving toward the right while I'm shooting charged attacks is enough to evade damage. However, I do want to mention that you most likely will need to forego the 200 elemental mastery buff from C6 Diona because you do need to stand a distance away from the enemy to dodge projectiles with strafing. Lastly, most Amber players probably already know this, but you can hold Amber's skill to throw Baron Bunny a distance from where you're standing. I'd like to add, however, that if you decide to hold her skill, I suggest holding it for as briefly as possible because the animation for throwing Amber's bunny is long and can cause you to lose buffs. Moreover, if you hold her skill and let go of the bunny as soon as possible, the amount of time it takes to detonate Baron Bunny is virtually the same as if you pressed the skill and detonated it instead. However, there should rarely be a time where you have to hold Amber's skill, because the last ability in a rotation before on-fielding as Amber is Rosaria's skill, which should put you close to the enemy anyway. That covers all the information I have for Amber. Next up is Sucrose. In my opinion, Sucrose has the most influential mechanics out of all 4 characters. I want to first talk about Sucrose's C1 constellation. This allows her to use a second skill every other rotation. One use of the second skill is to give an elemental mastery buff to Rosaria by replacing Sucrose's normal attack with her skill during her first turn in the full rotation. Additionally, in area of effect situations, Sucrose's second skill in the rotation, which comes near the end of Amber's fiery range duration, can reapply pyro on enemies by swirling the lingering pyro aura on all enemies. This allows Rosaria to reverse melt up to the first 2 hits of her burst, which isn't anything impressive but is still an improvement if we want to push the team's damage output. Sucrose's burst also has 2 use cases other than grouping enemies. Firstly, it's possible to use Sucrose's burst to help Rosaria reverse melt more hits. In single target, you want to make her burst infuse pyro to extend the pyro application into Rosaria's second turn in a rotation. This can be done by casting Sucrose's burst immediately before bursting on Amber, which can sometimes allow Rosaria to reverse melt the first 2 hits of her burst. In an area of effect setting, however, in my experience, it doesn't matter much what element her burst infuses. Even with cryo infusion, the pyro swirls from the anemo damage will still prolong the pyro application just long enough for Rosaria to sometimes reverse melt both the first 2 hits of her burst and the 2 hits of her skill. The second use case of Sucrose's burst is to help Sucrose give an elemental mastery buff from her 2 ascension passives to both Amber and Rosaria when Sucrose only has 1 charge of her skill available for a given rotation. This is possible because Sucrose's burst can trigger both ascension passives while she's off-field. To pull this off, all you need to do is cast both Sucrose's skill and her burst when it's her first turn in a rotation. The skill will swirl cryo, while the burst will both hit enemies and swirl pyro during Amber's fiery rain. To show that it's possible to give these elemental mastery buffs to both Amber and Rosaria with just a single use of Sucrose's skill and burst in the whole rotation, I'll first show Amber and Rosaria's stats before committing the rotation. I'll also show Sucrose's elemental mastery stat for those who want to see it. Then, I'll show Amber and Rosaria's stats after Amber deploys Baron Bunny. Of course, you won't always get Sucrose's burst back every rotation, but when you do have it, consider casting it for at least one of these two use cases. Now, I should give a bit of a warning about casting Sucrose's burst. Typically, reverse melting both Rosaria's first 2 hits of her burst and the 2 hits of her skill should be enough to remove the pyro aura on the enemy. However, against many enemies, it's unlikely that you'll hit every enemy with Rosaria's burst and skill, so there might still remain at least one enemy with a pyro aura. Especially if your Sucrose has her C2 constellation, Sucrose's burst may swirl that remaining pyro aura onto the other enemies again after Rosaria's burst into skill combo. This will prolong the pyro aura just long enough to prevent Amber from melting. It's sometimes difficult to tell if there's an enemy with a remaining pyro aura during a chaotic battle, so I suggest stalling on Sucrose to delay the rotation a bit, or consider not casting Sucrose's burst and sticking to the basic rotation if you want to minimize this risk. If you want to stall on Sucrose, you can commit the rest of the rotation after 2 instances of damage from the burst. Lastly, Sucrose's grouping capabilities are limited against heavy enemies such as Black Serpent Knights because her burst pushes these enemies away instead of pulling them together. The only solution I have is to save both of Sucrose's skill cooldowns and use them back to back on Sucrose's second turn in a rotation. Once again, keep in mind that Sucrose can only do this once every other rotation because of the 15-second cooldown. I don't have anything else to add for Sucrose, so I'll now move on to discussing Rosaria's additional mechanics. For Rosaria, I'll start by explaining why I use her burst before her skill for her second turn in a rotation. Firstly, if you do the rotation as fast as possible, Rosaria's skill will still be on cooldown when you reach your second turn in the rotation, so you can't use her skill first anyway without awkwardly waiting a bit. Secondly, Rosaria's first 2 hits of her burst have higher scalings than the 2 hits of her skill. I brought up previously that it's also sometimes possible to reverse melt 2 instances of Rosaria's damage in this part of the rotation, so we should prioritize reverse melting Rosaria's burst. Thirdly, because my Rosaria uses Noblesse Oblige, casting her burst first will buff the skill. Lastly, using the skill last allows her to funnel some particles into Amber, who, once again, has the biggest energy issue in a team. An overlooked mechanic related to her skill is that it can replace a dash to dodge attacks. One example would be in my 3.6 Spiral Abyss run, where I used Rosaria's skill to relocate myself behind a galloping Frost Magukengi. Additionally, repositioning using Rosaria's skill allows a better camera angle on enemies. Specifically, I recommend to other players to try to have all enemies in their field of view, so they don't miss information on enemy body language. It may not be immediately clear why this is sometimes important, so I'll show a clip from my 3.8 Spiral Abyss run where I didn't position correctly. When I fought the Hilichurls, I used Rosaria's skill in a way that put me in an awkward position between the lone Hilichurl rogue on the left and the other 2 Hilichurl enemies next to each other. Not being able to see the Hilichurl rogue almost caused me to take a heavy hit. Instead, I should have used Rosaria's skill to dash behind the Hilichurl rogue in front of me. In that position, I can turn my camera to the left to see all Hilichurls, so I don't miss when they're about to attack me. On a related note about movement, you may have noticed some dissonance between Amber and Rosaria's playstyle. Rosaria wants to be close to the enemy, while Amber sometimes doesn't, though I have a strategy to play around this dissonance. If you're not standing close to the enemy during Amber's first and second charge attacks, try to walk closer to the enemy during those charge attacks, so you don't have to spend time dashing to get in range for Rosaria's skill to hit the enemy. To illustrate why it's important to start walking toward the enemy, I'll show a clip from the 3.8 Spiral Abyss rotation of me missing Rosaria's skill on the Baptismal Bishop herd. Here, I tunnel vision the rapid fire attack and forget to walk toward one of the bishops. Thus, I miss Rosaria's skill and lose out on both the cryo particles and the white particles from Favonius lands, causing me to awkwardly normal attack to at least spawn the white particles. You may have noticed that Rosaria's first or third skills in a rotation don't contribute much damage to the fight and are mostly there for energy generation. Against enemies that drop a ton of energy, it's okay to skip Rosaria's first and third skills and add 1 or 2 more charge attacks on Amber. In the footage from my 3.5 Spiral Abyss run, even though I skipped Rosaria's third skill and replaced it with extra charge attacks from Amber, I still got Amber's burst back before the next rotation. There is a way to slightly increase the chance that Rosaria procs Favonius Lance's passive without making the rotation noticeably tighter for Amber. Rosaria's first normal attack animation is fast, so you can add a quick normal attack after casting her skill and immediately swap to the next character. I will show a clip against the Jade Bloom Terror Shroom during my 3.7 Spiral Abyss run, where I used this mechanic multiple times. This animation happens in a few milliseconds if you swap off as soon as you normal attack once, barely adding any time to the full rotation. Lastly, it's possible to funnel the particles from Rosaria's first skill in the rotation into Amber without changing any part of the rotation. While doing the early actions in the full rotation, add a few dashes in a direction away from where the particles spawn. This should give you enough time to squeeze in Sucrose's normal attack for the Cryo Swirl before the Cryo and White Energy particles reach your active character. This tip, however, may sometimes be difficult to pull off, so I'll show an alternative to this. Instead of swapping to Sucrose after Rosaria, you can directly swap to Amber to catch all the particles from Rosaria and even Diona. This does come at the cost of extending the rotation by 1 second due to the character switching cooldown, but it is more reliable to use. That was the final point I wanted to share about Rosaria, so I'll discuss additional mechanics for the last character in Amber's team, Diona. There isn't much to talk about for Diona, so I'll try to keep this section brief. Most of these are just subtle details that don't have as much impact on the team as many of the other mechanics do, but I'll mention them anyway for anyone who wants to consider them. In the full rotation, you may sometimes swap when Diona's hold skill and burst come into rotation. Using her hold skill or burst first is situational, but I'll briefly mention reasons to use one over the other first. Starting with reasons to use hold skill first, the main reason would be to cast Signature Mix later in the rotation, so you get longer uptime on a 200 elemental mastery buff when Amber is on field. The only other reason I see to use hold skill first is that you didn't end the previous chamber in a Spiral Abyss with everyone's burst back. Regarding the reasons to use Signature Mix first, this would be beneficial if you need more shielding for Amber when she goes on field. Additionally, if Amber is below 50% HP, she won't receive the 200 elemental mastery buff, so casting Signature Mix early will allow Amber to heal during the setup phase of the full rotation and before she deploys Baron Bunny. This field will still stay long enough for the Bunny and some charge attacks to receive the 200 elemental mastery buff. Of course, sometimes you may end your full rotation early because you defeat enemies in a partial rotation. If one of Diona's abilities is on cooldown, that is another reason to swap the order of Diona's abilities in the next full rotation. The example I'm showing on screen right now is the only recorded example of me needing to swap the order of Diona's abilities for this reason. It may not be easy to notice what happened without more context, so I'll put a link in the description to the full run for anyone who needs it. The in-game description for Diona's C6 constellation excludes some information about the 200 elemental mastery buff. Firstly, unlike the attack buff from Bennett's burst, the 200 elemental mastery buff will apply immediately upon swapping characters in Signature Mix's field. Recall that Rosaria has opportunities to reverse melt a few times in a rotation. If the active character is not Rosaria, but she swaps on field and instantly casts her burst, she will still snapshot the 200 elemental mastery buff. For context, my Rosaria's build has 0 elemental mastery. I'll also display on screen the difference in Rosaria's damage with and without Signature Mix to show that instantly casting Rosaria's burst on swap still snapshots the 200 elemental mastery buff. The instant snapshotting of the 200 elemental mastery buff is especially useful in combination with the tip about committing the rotation in situations that would otherwise be dangerous, because Rosaria would want to cast her burst as soon as possible for the iframes anyway. Secondly, the 200 elemental mastery buff will linger for 2 seconds after stepping out of Signature Mix or after the field disappears. Diona's Signature Mix placement will typically be close to the enemy, which makes it difficult for Amber to avoid damage. Thus, one application of the lingering buff is to give Amber a chance to briefly distance herself from the enemy by stepping out of Signature Mix's field while still keeping the 200 elemental mastery buff for the amplified melt damage. That covers all the important information that I wanted to discuss for these 4 characters on Amber's melt team. I will now move on to describing the advanced rotation for this team. I mentioned that I would include an advanced rotation for this team that incorporates the points I brought up about using Sucrose's second skill charge or her burst to give elemental mastery buffs to both Amber and Rosaria. In most cases, Sucrose only gets her burst back once every other rotation. On a related note, as mentioned before, because Sucrose's skill is on a 15-second cooldown, she only gets access to 2 charges every other rotation. However, even with these 2 restrictions, it's still possible for Sucrose to give elemental mastery buffs from both of her ascension passives to Amber and Rosaria every rotation. I've recently come up with 2 different versions of the full rotation that I alternate between to sustain the elemental mastery buffs on Amber and Rosaria, though the only difference is Sucrose's ability usage. I'll show both rotations. You start off with Diona's hold skill, then use Rosaria's skill, Sucrose's skill into burst, Amber's burst, Diona's burst, Sucrose's normal attacks, Rosaria's burst into skill, Amber's skill, and detonate Baron Bunny, Amber's first charge attack, then a second charge attack, Rosaria's skill, Amber's third charge attack, and a fourth charge attack. Then start the next rotation of Diona's hold skill, Rosaria's skill, Sucrose's skill, Amber's burst, Diona's burst, Sucrose's skill, Rosaria's burst into skill, Amber's skill, and detonate Baron Bunny, Amber's first charge attack, and then a second charge attack, Rosaria's skill, Amber's third charge attack, and a fourth charge attack. And you just continue to alternate between these 2 rotations. That was a lot of information about optimizing each character's actions in the full rotation, but I still have some obscure mechanics to share. I would like to preface this section by mentioning that I'm about to talk about some highly situational mechanics and even some bugs that you probably won't ever need to use nor notice most of the time, but I'll still describe them in case some players want to know them. The most frequent obscure mechanic in my experience is that Amber's C1 arrow can steal melt from the main arrow. Don't quote me on this, but I think this happens because the moment Amber lets go of her charge attack, both the main and C1 arrows spawn in concurrently with active hitboxes. It's just that the C1 arrow is invisible and doesn't move from Amber's position until a small amount of time after the main arrow has fired. But for some reason, the game prioritizes registering damage from the C1 arrow over the main arrow if Amber stands point blank in front of the enemy. Now, you're probably thinking, Turtle, why would I ever stand that close to the enemy as an archer? Well, you might not intentionally stand that close to the enemy, but some enemies in the game will do something to close the distance. For example, Magu-Kenki has an attack that pulls the player toward it, which puts them close enough to trigger this bug. Additionally, some lava turtles in a spiral abyss, for some reason, continue to path toward the player until they're in the player's face. There is a mechanic that I like to call the double melt. To give some context behind the double melt, I first need to describe some other details about Amber. It's possible for a single charged attack to hit both the enemy and detonate Baron Bunny. Additionally, there is a small delay between the time the arrow registers damage on an enemy and the time Baron Bunny registers damage. However, the charge attack and Baron Bunny don't share the same internal cooldown for melting. This means it's possible to melt both the charge attack and Baron Bunny's damage with that single arrow. Now, I want to give a heads up by saying that this mechanic is extremely difficult to pull off and not recommended to learn. There is a risk that comes with double melting, in which messing up its timing not only will cause Baron Bunny to not melt but also override the Cryo Aura with a Pyro 1, preventing you from melting your subsequent charged attacks. I can't even pull this off consistently myself and have to reset Spiral Abyss runs because of the failed double melt. But for those who for some reason still want to learn a strategy for double melting, the strategy with the highest success rate for me personally is to do the part of the rotation starting from Rosaria's burst into Baron Bunny's damage as fast as possible. By the time you charge up an arrow, you should find that the timing for shooting Baron Bunny works out with Rosaria's cryo application tick rate. Rosaria should apply cryo again before you deal melt damage with additional charge attacks. There is a case where one of Amber's arrows in her fully charged attack can deal physical damage instead of pyro damage. I'll show some clips on screen where this happens. I'm not 100% sure why this happens, but I do have a theory that might explain this phenomenon. In all the recordings that capture an instance of this bug, I noticed that they involve Amber either taking or iframing damage right when one of the arrows hits the enemy. One way I've been replicating this bug is by shooting Magu-Kenki during its plunging attack. Often, I can see one of the arrows turn into physical damage. In my opinion, this bug rarely happens and is not easy to control outside of just playing your distance from your enemies, which is difficult to do when you have C6 Diona and need to stand in her signature mix for the additional 200 elemental mastery buff. If you want to try to avoid this issue, however, I'd recommend doing the tip where you try to keep all enemies in your field of view. That way, you can gauge the best time to shoot a charged attack. Another mechanic related to Amber is that she can slightly increase the speed at which she shoots charge attacks by using R animation cancelling. Specifically, between every charged attack, you alternate between double tapping R and dashing to load up the next charge attack faster. Double tapping R very slightly decreases the amount of time it takes for Amber to charge up her attack. This mechanic isn't that obscure, as it's a known mechanic for all bow characters, but I didn't put it in the section about Amber's additional mechanics because there are a few cases where I found this mechanic to be problematic. But I'll still briefly mention it in case players want to incorporate this into their gameplay. The reason I don't often use R animation cancelling in this melt team is that Amber can shoot faster than Rosaria can apply cryo, so you might sometimes land an arrow before Rosaria reapplies cryo on the enemy. Thus, you lose out on the amplified damage from melting. The only time I've ever used R animation cancelling is against enemies like the Golden Wolf Lord and the Thundering Manifestation, where it's difficult or even impossible to apply cryo on them. In these cases, I might as well shoot faster anyway because I can't melt. With this amount of information, I am aware that it may be overwhelming to try to implement these tips into your gameplay, so I dedicated the final chapter of this guide to a VOD review of my gameplay in the Spiral Abyss. Specifically, I will go over existing footage I have of my Melt Amber runs and detail my thought process. I will also point out mistakes and things that I could have done better in these runs. Doing so, I hope to demonstrate how I try to implement these tips into my gameplay. This final chapter will be informal because it's mostly me just outlining what's on my mind as I watch the run. I'll be slowing down the footage or even pausing it if I need to elaborate on something. And right from the beginning, I already see something that could be slightly improved. Notice that all 4 characters already have their bursts back, so generating additional particles on Diona isn't necessary. However, I do still think I should keep the shield, so what I should have done instead is hold S on the keyboard and make Diona backflip toward the Magu-Kenkis, which displaces herself closer to the bosses rather than away from them. Other than use Rosaria's skill to get to the center of the fight faster, I used the tip of chaining iframes to nullify some incoming damage from the Magu-Kenkis when some of them started to attack me. Now, I've already shown this clip in the chapter for Sucrose's mechanics, but once again, notice how Sucrose's burst prolonged the pyro application just long enough to let Rosaria reverse melt for a small amount of extra damage, but not too long to the point that it left the pyro aura on the Magu-Kenkis when Amber starts to deal melt damage. I've also already shown this clip, but here I apply the tip of intentionally holding Baron Bunny when I see an attack that will knock the bunny out of range of the Magu-Kenkis. Unfortunately, I didn't keep the footage of my failed runs for this chamber, but I do recall that the plunging attack not only knocked Baron Bunny out of range of all 3 Kenkis, but also destroyed it, so I lost out on over 500,000 damage from that single ability. In this part, I think I made the right play of using Rosaria's skill to reposition myself, even though I got enough energy from the Kenkis to let me skip her 3rd skill in the rotation. This is because the Lone Gale Kenki walked out of my field of view, so I wouldn't be able to see when it would attack. However, I should have positioned more to the left of the Galloping Frost Kenki. The Lone Gale Kenki was walking to his left, so positioning myself more to my left would have caused the Lone Gale Kenki to make its way toward the other Kenkis. Consequently, the Lone Gale Kenki stays far away from the other 2 Kenkis for a good portion of this fight. Next, I make a small misplay. I should have skipped Rosaria's 1st skill in the rotation because everyone already had their burst and it put me in a position where I couldn't see the Lone Gale Kenki again. As a result, I'm forced to awkwardly move my camera between the Kenkis to get information about their body language. Fortunately, because I was in the beginning of my rotation, I could mitigate this issue by chaining iframes to nullify most incoming damage, even if my mispositioning caused me to miss some information about the attacks. During Rosaria's 2nd turn in the rotation, I almost dashed out of habit to iframe damage, but I realized at the last second that these Kenkis have a slow turning speed, so I saved a bit of stamina with the dash by using Rosaria's skill to evade the Galloping Frost Kenki's slash. Additionally, using Rosaria's skill put me in a good position to see all 3 Kenkis in my field of view. I believe Amber would have died if I had not positioned here. Specifically, keeping all 3 Kenkis in my field of view not only helped me dodge the Lone Gale Kenki's attack, but also notice the Galloping Frost Kenki's plunging attack. That way, I could keep a mental timer for when I need to stop shooting charge attacks to iframe the huge incoming damage. Here, I believe is another good example of chaining iframes to nullify a ton of incoming damage. 2 of the Kenkis started chaining numerous slash attacks against me. The shield broke early because I messed up the first iframe, but I took almost no damage from the subsequent slash attacks. I think the only damage I took came from the damage over time cryo field. Once again, I used Sucrose's burst to prolong the pyro application just a bit to let Rosaria reverse melt a few hits, but I lost the chance to reverse melt the 2 hits of Rosaria's skill. This might be difficult to notice, but there is a small misplay that caused this to happen. If we go back a bit in the footage, you'll notice that the character switching cooldown ended before I dashed the 2nd time on Sucrose. I should have gone straight to using Rosaria's burst instead of dashing. Other than iframing the final slash from the Lone Gale Kenki, I not only would have put Rosaria's burst in the location that would have hit all 3 Kenkis, but I also would have started Rosaria's reverse mode combo early enough to melt the 2 hits of her skill.
Another mistake that is difficult to notice is that I didn't aim Amber's bunny placement correctly in this part of the footage. I don't have an input overlay to show what I pressed, but I was holding W and D, which made Amber face a bit diagonally to the right. This caused Amber to place Baron Bunny too far from the lone guild Kenki, so I lost out on 160,000 damage. Instead, I should have only held W because my camera was already facing the correct direction. The Kenkis were moving to the location where I faced the camera, so Baron Bunny would have been able to hit all of them. At this point of the VOD review, some of you are probably thinking, Turtle, aren't you missing Diona's C6 constellation? Since Signature Mix won't give an elemental mastery buff to you anyway, why not just swap her Signature Mix and Icy Pulse in a rotation so you get more defensive utility when Amber on field? And you would be totally right about that. The only reason I try to use Signature Mix later in the rotation is to help me get used to less defensive utility for the time I do get C6 Diona. Then again, I'm not even standing in Signature Mix most of the time in the first place, so trying to practice this way probably isn't meaningful. I would analyze a second run, but this video has become lengthy. Despite elaborating on the intricacies of C2 Melt Amber and the 4-star characters on this team, I still believe it's possible to push the limits of this team further. There may be strategies and mechanics that I'm not aware of that could optimize ability usage and buff management, or simply increase the average damage output for each rotation. For example, what if there exists a rotation that lets Amber use her Baron Bunny every 15 seconds instead of letting Baron Bunny sit off cooldown for 5 seconds due to the rotation lasting 20 seconds? Moreover, if such a rotation is possible, will this increase the damage output considerably, given that some abilities like Signature Mix and Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers have a 20-second cooldown and won't be available for every Baron Bunny? Even though I intend this video to be a mechanics guide to playing C2 Melt Amber, I also hope that this video encourages more players to try out the C2 Melt Amber playstyle, and perhaps even experiment with the limitations of missing her C4 constellation. Aside from the potential research angles for C2 Melt Amber, I want to end this video by expressing my gratitude to everyone who has helped me with this video project. You guys have helped me tremendously with various things for this guide, including but not limited to proofreading the script, verifying the correctness of information, and recording footage with me. Additionally, thanks a million to those who have subscribed to me. I greatly appreciate all the support and wanted to show that appreciation by creating this guide. I believe that most players who subscribed to me did so because of my Amber related content, so I hope this guide is useful to you all. And with that, I conclude my 250 subscribers video. Good luck to all the new and existing Melt Amber players, and I wish you all well in your endeavors with this team.